Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for our Composting Basics webinar. My name's Jordan and I'm the Sustainability Officer at North Sydney Council, and this here webinar is part of our Green Events program where we run about 20 to 30 sustainability related events in person and online throughout the year. And this is one of our most in-demand workshops on composting. But before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Camaragal people, the original custodians of North Sydney, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So yeah, thank you for joining us tonight. We're very lucky to have Compostable Kate, as she's known on Instagram, who puts fantastic content up on everything you need to know from worm farming, compost bins, Bokashi bins. So Kate will be talking us through all the composting basics. So thank you very much for joining us and welcome, Kate. I'll just pin you now, Kate. Okay. You're on mute, I think, Kate.
Yes, there we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's always a real privilege to have an hour, possibly an hour and a half of your time to talk about my favourite topic. So the way that I am pitching this this session is for beginners. So you may have a compost bin that you've got going currently, or you may have never done it before. So either way, I'm going to be going through why we compost, the real importance of it, not only for our soil, but also for the planet. And I'm going to be sharing all of my tips and tricks so you can compost successfully. So if you're coming here with zero knowledge, that's wonderful. If you're coming with a compost bin that might be stinky or not working efficiently, that's totally fine as well. So this session should really help steer you in the right direction so you can become really comfortable and confident making compost in your own backyard. What I really do encourage, I was just saying to Jordan, I've done my first in-person event after a huge COVID break. And I am a trained teacher and educator, and I really, really encourage you to ask me questions throughout the session. So obviously this is not a face-to-face workshop, and it's harder for me to gauge your questions without you chucking them at me. So Jordan's going to be directing your questions to me. So throughout this session, we will have a formal Q&A at the end, but I really do encourage you to ask me as we go. Jordan will pop up in a moment if the Zoom gods are in our favor. Yes, looks like they are. I've got this PowerPoint, which I'm not going to be reading from. So, this is there for you to have a look at, for you to think about if you've got any questions from it, and to guide this conversation, because I really could happily talk about compost for 3 hours, but this will hopefully keep the pace moving. Jordan, are we able to pin me while it's here, or is that going to be a tricky thing, do you think? Jordan? Ooh. So looks like Jordan's on mute. So I am not sure if you can see me at the moment. Hopefully, Jordan, can everyone see me?
So
it's fine.
Sorry, Kate. I couldn't find the main screen there. Yep. So I have pinned you. So I'll share screen. Can everyone just let us know in the chat if you can also see Kate as she's talking there with the screen up? Yes. Okay. Yes, we're all good to go.
Oh, cool. Fantastic. There we go. Thanks, Louise. So we're going to start from the ground up. So we're doing an hour together of compost basics. And I really want you to come away from this session feeling really confident to be able to employ these techniques yourself. So if you could pop to the next slide, please, Jordan. So we're going to be going through the benefits of compost, which are numerous. I'm going to be explaining the principles of composting. There is a universal recipe that is really easy to follow because there's only 4 key ingredients. I'm going to be explaining the whole process of composting. So from the very beginning, when you've got food waste in a bucket ready to be brought out into your yard, all the way through to the beautiful, friable, humus-rich, finished, crumbly compost that you can then apply on your garden. We're going to touch on which system will work best for you. So because this is pitched at North Sydney Council, I understand there's going to be people from all around Australia in this session as well. But because the target audience is North Sydney Council, we're going to be looking at smaller scale solutions for composting. So things that you could do if you live in an apartment, or things if you have a small courtyard. So we'll go through that. Troubleshooting, because compost, unfortunately, is an art. It's not an exact science. There are processes that I can explain to you, but things will go wrong, and that's how you learn to refine your compost recipe. So we'll go through that, and then Q&A time. But as I have said, I really do encourage you to direct your questions through the chat, and Jordan will ask me throughout the session. Next slide, please, Jordan. So why compost? Compost is a sustainable action that is hugely significant to the planet. Food waste feeds climate change, to put it very simply. Australian households waste an awful lot of edible food, and we also waste a lot of food that has gone beyond its use by. So every week we have creating scraps that can be eaten, and we're putting those into landfill. We're also to put it simply, so this wastage is per person about 312 kilos. So it's a huge amount of food waste. We know these facts and figures. We know that when food waste hits landfill, it releases methane, and methane is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of trapping heat in the atmosphere. So these are facts that we know are true. And yet, as a society, we are still continuing to fill up our rubbish bins with food waste. But if you're here tonight, I think it's because you're excited to do something about it. Compost is a really empowering, sustainable action because we can reverse that narrative. We can feed our soil. We can really turn trash into treasure in our own backyard. And it's something that we should feel excited about, because once you start seeing the transformation of scraps into soil, you really want to do it more and more. So next slide, please, Jordan. So what does compost do? We know that the harm that food waste has on our planet, but in terms of the benefit of compost, it is numerous. So to put it very simply, I like to think of compost as soil food. So food itself, the scraps, are food for our body, but then when we change it into compost, it becomes food for your soil. Productive gardens, so whether you have pots or whether you have a container garden or whether you have a courtyard or a backyard, they're hungry. So every time we have a growing season, the plants are using nutrients in the soil, and we need to replenish those. And the way that you can do it very simply is by feeding your soil and your plants compost. Compost helps buffer the pH of soil. So if you have alkaline soil or quite acidic soil, compost doesn't dramatically change the pH, but it buffers the soil so your plants can access nutrients from it much more easily. It really can transform the texture of your soil. So if you have sandy soil, it helps capture nutrients and water. If you have clay soil, it helps open up the pore space within that really dense growing material. And it can suppress plant diseases and pests. It's really a wondrous ingredient. And I think really significantly as well, looking at compost within the climate change debate, when we return food waste and household carbon, so carbon is brown matter, so things like newspapers, paper towels, brown leaves, when we return the nitrogen and the carbon into our soil, it actually is a form of carbon sequestration, which basically means we're storing the carbon in the soil, we're not releasing it to the atmosphere. So really, compost is an incredible thing that we can all be making in our own backyard. Even if you don't have a yard, there's still ways to make it, and I'll go through that this session. Next slide, please.
Okay, just a quick question from Michael about, should we measure the pH level of our compost?
It is a useful thing to do. So that's sort of like going up from being a beginner composter. But the reason why it's useful is compost microbes, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, are the biggest group of biology that is breaking down your food waste and your carbon. And they operate most efficiently under neutral to slightly acidic pH. If you're adding in lots of alkaline ingredients, so chicken manure, for instance, people think it's acidic, but actually it's quite alkaline. You can increase the pH of your compost too much, and then those compost microbes won't be efficient. So testing your compost is a little bit of useful data to get back to check that you're working within the range that the microbes like. So in terms of the principles of compost, if you have a bin in your backyard and you're chucking your food waste in, that's the beginning of making compost, but it's not, you're not doing things as efficiently as you can, because we need to feed the microbes that are swimming all over us. So I'm covered in microbes, my banana peel is, my brown leaves that I've raked up from my backyard. We're basically walking petri dishes of good and bad bacteria, and we need to capture that bacteria in our compost bin. So compost happens every day in nature. If you rake back the leaves underneath on a forest floor, you'll see that there's some berries, dry leaves, dead animals. That's natural. That's Mother Nature making compost. When we're doing it in our compost bin or pile, we want to replicate that process. But because we're doing it in a controlled environment, we need to be a little bit more aware of the principles so that we can make sure it's not going to become a stinky mess. So as I said, compost is really driven by microbes. Sometimes when you first start out, you think it's the biggest decomposer of your pile is compost worms, and they are really important, but really it's microbes, and we need to be feeding them a balanced diet, which I'll get into it in a moment. So compost is effectively decomposed organic matter, and organic matter is any living or dead plant or animal materials. So we've got our food waste, we have our brown leaves, we have our pulled out plants that we have pulled out at the end of summer. We have our oyster shells. So anything that was recently alive or has recently died that has come from a plant or an animal can be composted. So I'm a bit of a no rules composter. I love composting meat. I love composting dairy. I really like to capture the full spectrum of fertility from all of these things that people sometimes say, oh no, you can't compost citrus, you can't compost garlic. And that's really not true. Anything that was recently alive or has recently died can be composted, because if we couldn't, just imagine all the piles of citrus that would be hanging around on our planet. So basically in our home compost bin, we speed up the process of decomposition by creating a balanced compost pile so that bacteria, fungi, and our earthworms, slaters, slugs even, soldier fly larvae, all of those members of the soil food web can start breaking down our scraps. But for that to happen efficiently, we need 4 inputs. So I talk about them as greens, which is our nitrogen. So that's the juicy stuff, our food waste, manure, your spent plants that you've pulled up from the ground, your coffee grinds. So it's a bit of a tricky term when I say greens, because it doesn't have to be coloured green to be counted as a nitrogen-rich ingredient. So that's the first ingredient of great compost. The second is carbon, and it's an essential ingredient that lots of people sometimes sleep on. They forget to add it, and then their compost stinks. And if you only, this is a shocking but true fact, if you only add nitrogen, so your food waste, into your compost bin without adding carbon, it will release methane. So we don't want to create little mini landfills in our backyard. So we have to balance nitrogen with carbon. So that's the dead, dry stuff: brown leaves, hay, straw, lucerne, wood chips, newspaper, office paper. And I can, if anyone has questions, there's some really important safety checks that you can check for manufactured carbon to check for the presence of PFAS chemicals. So we can get into that if you're interested. The third ingredient is oxygen, which doesn't really feel like a tangible input to add into your compost pile. You know, it's hard to capture handfuls of air, but the way that you layer and make your compost, you can capture air into it. And you can also manually aerate and turn your compost bin. So if you have a tumbler, that's easy to do. But if you have an on-ground bin, which are my favorite enclosed bins for urban areas, you can do that with a corkscrew compost aerator to turn your organic matter and incorporate air. Because just like us, the compost microbes and worms all need oxygen. So composting is what's called an aerobic and oxygen-rich process. Finally, the fourth ingredient of really great compost is water. So all life on Earth needs air to breathe and water to drink. And that's the same with all of the biology in your compost. And I'm going to, as I go through explaining how to build a compost bin, explain how much water you need, because it is quite specific. Before I move on, is there any questions about at this point, Jordan, that I can answer?
Yeah, we've got a question. There are a few questions. I think some of them you will cover in a bit later.
Okay. Yep.
So we'll get back to them. But Alexandra asks, can you have too much air oxygen when you're composting?
Yes, that's a great question. You can. So if you have an open pile and you have big winds that blow through your pile, if it dries out, so if there's just too much aeration and the water content ends up drying out because there's so much air, compost will become inefficient. So you do need to have the balance of air plus the balance of moisture. And I'll address that now because we're onto it. So when you are thinking about the right moisture content of your compost, it should feel like a well wrung out sponge. So, you know, if you've run your sponge in your kitchen under your tap and it's dripping wet, that's not what we want compost to feel like. If you wring out the water and so the sponge itself feels moist to touch, and if you really give it a squeeze, you might be able to get 1 or 2 drops of water out. That's what your compost should feel like. So your compost, there should be a small amount of water over all of the organic matter within your compost, because that on that little film of liquid, that's where there's a huge amount of microbial activity. But you don't want to be able to grab a handful and be able to squeeze out bucket loads of water, because what's going to happen is that's going to push out the air and your compost is going to become anaerobic, which is a fancy term for oxygen free. And there's anaerobic microbes that are the nasty, smelly microbes. So when your compost starts smelling, that's because you've got a bad batch of microbes starting to multiply in oxygen-free conditions. But we can fix that by aerating. So it's that balance. And that's the thing about composting. I could talk to you about the theory of it, but in practice, you need to get really one of the biggest skills with making good compost is observation. So looking at what's happening in your compost bin and tweaking things as you go, because every compost pile is going to be different depending on the season, depending on what you've been eating, depending on what you've been growing. So there are always going to be variabilities. I hope that answered the question. So now our compost recipe, let me give you a bit more detail about that. So I think I've outlined in enough detail the water. So you're aiming for 40 to 60% hydration, which should feel like a wrung out sponge. So in summer, you will have to add water. In winter, it's very unlikely that you will, because your food waste is about 90% water anyway. So that will be providing enough moisture in the cooler months. But in summer, especially if there's a heat wave, you will need to water down your compost to make sure those microbes are happy and not drying out. So I'm going to jump back up to number 1 here. So nitrogen is the juicy green stuff. It's something that we produce a lot of. So if you cook, if you go out and eat, if you garden, you're going to be swimming in nitrogen-rich scraps. And that's often the group of scraps that we think are most important to compost, because, we know that food waste, once it hits landfill, releases methane. But people don't realize this, but an awful lot of carbon, so that's newspapers, office paper, paper towels, napkins, ends up in landfill too. And carbon is highly resistant to degradation in landfill. It's basically just sits there. And it's full of nutrients that should be returned to the soil. So yes, we can absolutely recycle some of it. And I think some carbon should be recycled as opposed to composted. But if you are producing household carbon that can't be recycled, paper towels, for instance, once they have got food waste on them or they're wet, they can't be composted. Sorry, they can't be recycled. So really they should be composted, because otherwise they're just going to sit in landfill and not break down, and those nutrients can be returned to your soil. So you always want to have a balance of the browns and the greens. For beginner composters, the easiest way to envision it is if you have a compost caddy. So that's basically like a little bucket. It doesn't have to be fancy. It could be a 2 litre yogurt plastic tub that you fill up with your food waste as you're cooking. If you fill that up, you want to then add in the equal amount, so the same size bucket of carbon, every single time you add your food waste. You don't want to just be pouring your food waste into your compost bin without adding the carbon, because otherwise the balance is going to be off and things are going to start smelling. Talking about coffee grounds for a moment, so thinking about the demographic of North Sydney Council, and definitely in our house we drink a lot of coffee. Coffee is full of nitrogen, but you do need to be a little bit mindful. So if you're getting into composting and you put on your compost colored glasses and you start seeing cafes handing out big bags of their spent grounds, it's a fantastic activator. So coffee grounds are really, really useful to add into your compost, but they do have caffeine and they do have other slightly plant suppressing chemicals in them. So always make sure you add no more than about 20 to 25% coffee grounds with the mix. So diversity is key. Adding in your food waste, coffee grounds, I live in Bega, so I have fresh chicken manure to add into my my compost bins, but pelletized chicken manure is a really useful nitrogen-rich ingredient that you can access anywhere. So if you can capture a whole spectrum of different ingredients to add into your compost, you're going to have a really efficient system, and you're going to have really nutrient-rich compost to finish. So to put it very simply, in terms of those browns and greens, aim for a 50-50 ratio. But talking about carbon now, if you have access to something like wood shavings or wood chips, they are full of a lot of carbon. So all ingredients have what's called a C-N ratio, and that is a balance of the amount of nitrogen and carbon in all animal and plant products. Wood chips are really high in carbon, so you wouldn't need to add as much. So that could be then a 40%. If you're composting a lot of wood chips, you might want to aim for 40% wood chips and 60% food waste. Whereas if you are adding brown leaves, they have less carbon. So then you would need to add around 60% brown leaves to your food waste. There's always a balance, but to put it really simply, so you don't walk away from this confused, aiming for 50-50 greens to brown is a really winning ratio.
Hey, do the compost recipe, does that apply for all different types of compost bins, including tumblers?
Tumblers, I actually like to add more carbon. So the reason is, if you have a tumbler that doesn't have perforated holes, so it basically is just one big solid barrel, that's not going to drain lactate. So lactate is the your food waste starting to break down, and tumblers, if they are one solid barrel, won't drain excess liquid. So adding more carbon is essential, because otherwise your tumbler will quickly become anaerobic, which is a really common issue with tumbling compost bins. They kind of feel like the cure-all, you know, they're bins that are often sold to beginner compost creators because they are useful the way that they tumble, but they're not actually that easy to use. If you overfill them as well, Jordan, then it's almost impossible to aerate them. They just kind of move as one big lump. So with tumblers, I would aim for about 60% carbon to even 70%, depending on what you're adding. And observation, always look into your tumbler and see what's going on. Is it looking wet? If it is, add carbon, because carbon, being dry and brown, it doesn't always have to be brown, you know, you could use white office paper, but being dry acts like a sponge. So it's really useful to add it in if your compost is too wet. Oxygen, let's talk about that quickly. So we have mentioned that you can tumble your compost bin if you've got a tumbler to aerate it, as long as it's not overfilled. You can use a corkscrew compost aerator, which literally does look like a giant corkscrew. You screw it through the organic matter and pull it up, and that's a great way to add a lot of oxygen into the mix. If you find that that's too much hard work, you can also add oxygen by the way that you build your pile. So adding in chunky carbon, like wood chips, opens up what's called the pore space within your organic matter, and there'll be little amounts of oxygen that sit around those wood chips. Adding sticks into your compost bin as well, if you don't want to turn it, if you are physically unable or you don't have the time or energy, you can add sticks and wood chips, chunky carbon, bark, things like that are not going to break down really quickly. So not soft sources of carbon like newspaper, because that's not going to capture oxygen within the pile. So you can do, that's a totally efficient and a good way to add in oxygen if you don't want to get down and dirty and aerate your pile. But I personally love aerating my compost bins. I find it really therapeutic. You can, one other just quick compost hack that I'll give you, you can create a lung type effect within a compost bin through a couple of methods. So the first is you can get the back of a broom and wiggle it through the organic matter and create a hole within your compost, and that will actually draw in oxygen. So that's an easy way to do it without going out and buying a compost aerator. You can also build your compost bin around a little bundle of sticks. So if you have sticks in your backyard, or you can collect them from a park, you can tie them up with some biodegradable, you know, some hessian string, and position that in the center of your compost bin. If this is like an in-ground Dalek style compost bin that I'm talking about now, and build your layers around that, and that will draw oxygen into your compost too. So there's a number of ways that you can do it. Any questions, or should we move to the next
Just one question from Judith about adding cardboard boxes to compost. Should she be worried about the glue that sticks the cardboard together at all?
That's a great question. So now most modern glues are based with carbohydrates. So they are generally safe to compost, but there's not a huge amount of regulation around the solvents used in these glues. So I can't say definitively yes, but to put your mind at ease, I do compost what I call nude cardboard. So that's the plain brown corrugated cardboard all the time. And I use it in my no-dig garden beds as well. And it's a really universal practice in terms of organic gardeners doing that. Modern inks, I'll talk about that as well, are generally soy-based. So they are safe to compost, but I like to use cardboard that doesn't have that much ink on it personally. And always make sure you remove any plastic tape. A good way to break down cardboard. So if you have a big brown cardboard box that you're wanting to compost, if you chuck it into your compost bin, it's going to smother the airflow. So you always need to break it down. And if you wet it off first, then it will rip like butter. So you're wanting to make sure that pieces of cardboard are no bigger than the palm of your hand, because otherwise they will block airflow in your bin. Should we go to the next slide? So what I'm going to describe here is, if you can envision, the compost revolution, I'm pretty sure, sells these style of bins open to the ground, enclosed bins. So they look like Daleks from Doctor Who. They have a lid. They're generally made out of black recycled plastic. The compost bins that I have a couple of 220 litre enclosed bins like this and a couple of 400 litre enclosed bins. And the reason why I have plenty of space, living in the country, I could have open piles, but the reason why I have enclosed bins is because we have chickens, and I know that may bring rodents, and then we have brown snakes. So even in the country, I like to compost in enclosed bins, but definitely in smaller urban gardens like in North Sydney, they're really useful size and you can get them nice and compact. The reason why they're so good though is they're open to the ground, and that allows all of the biology that's in the soil access to your organic matter, which means you'll get finished compost far faster. But the process that I'm going to go through now, explaining how to compost in those open to the ground bins, you can also do in enclosed bins. So there's products like the AeroBin, which are useful if you don't have access to soil. So if you have got a paved outdoor area and you really want to have a compost bin, an AeroBin is a great solution because it's enclosed on the bottom. It has a drain that collects the compost lactate, so you won't get puddles of compost liquid on your tiles. And it has an internal lung as well. So these same steps will work for that too. So when you are setting up a compost bin, the setup really is key, and it will set you up for success if you follow just this really simple tip. Basically, when you put an open to the ground bin on the soil, it's a really good idea adding a bed of carbon, and that does a few things. So I like to include wood chips in that first carbon foundation layer. You can use broken up sticks. You can use softer sources of carbon as well, so things like cardboard or newspaper, but you must include some structural carbon, so bark, sticks, wood chips. And that won't break down for this first batch of compost that you're making. What it will do, it will act as a sponge to suck up any excess moisture. It will improve aeration because you're not just composting directly on the soil. You've got this airy bed of carbon sitting there. And fungi love wood chips. So you might see some activity of fungi starting to form in your compost, especially if you're cold composting, and that's a really great thing. So I always start with a layer of carbon. Then I like to inoculate my compost, and this is not essential, but it does help. So if you have a friend that has compost available, you could ask them for just a small bucket to pop in, or if you've made a previous batch of compost, keeping a small bucket and adding that in allows all of that beneficial biology to be injected into the mix straight away. The same works for worm castings and also healthy soil. So a lot of the biology that we have in our compost comes from the soil. So if you can dig a small bucket of soil into your compost bin, then you're really going to be setting yourself up for success. Then once you have created your foundation layers of carbon and an inoculant, you can start adding in your greens and your browns. So you can aim for either 50% greens to 50% browns, or you can add just a little bit more carbon, the brown layer, just a little bit more thicker each time you add it in. I really recommend, if you have the space, having a separate bin next to your compost bin. So just it can be a plastic tub or a normal trash bin with a lid, and keep your carbon in that. So if you have that next to your compost, that reminds you every time you empty your caddy of kitchen waste in, you then cover it with carbon. That keeps your microbes happy because you're feeding them that balanced diet. And also what it does is every single time you add in food waste, if you cover it with carbon, that means that things like blowflies and vinegar flies are not able to lay their larvae on your exposed food waste. So you're not going to have a fly issue. And it also helps trap in any odors. So that's a really useful thing, keeping that carbon stockpile next to your compost. In terms of stirring it, so I think I feel like I've explained that in enough detail so you can have aeration happening in a static way by the way that you layer wood chips and sticks or piles of sticks in the middle, or you can do it actively with a garden fork or a corkscrew compost aerator. I also really recommend every time you add, well, not every time, ideally, if you want to be perfect at composting, it's a great idea to dig your scraps into your compost. So instead of always just chucking things on top, if you could have a small hand trowel and you dig a small hole into the core of your compost where there's the most activity. Sometimes if you have been adding a lot of ingredients at once, there'll also be heat generated by the thermophilic microbes in the center. If you can dig into that center area and pour in your food waste and then cover that with carbon, that does a few things. You're aerating and you're burying it in the center where there's a lot of activity, and you're making sure it's protected from any flies that especially will be present in summer. Adding in those green and brown layers is important if you don't want to aerate your compost at all. So if you want to do it in a static way by the processes that I have mentioned, it's a good idea pre-mixing your browns and your greens. So you can imagine in summertime, if you have a lawn and you've done a lot of lawn mowing and you've got a huge amount of grass clippings, if you add that in a green layer and then add brown leaves on top, there's not going to be very much contact between the nitrogen and the carbon. And that's when you might run into issues if you're not going to ever manually aerate your bin, because you need to have a lot of contact between all of that carbon and all of that nitrogen for the compost microbes to work effectively. If you don't, that green layer, especially if it's a grass layer, will start becoming anaerobic, turn into green slime and stink. So if your compost is ever stinky, it's telling you this is becoming anaerobic. You need to get out there and you need to aerate it, because you're starting to have a whole colony of bad anaerobic microbes taking over. And your neighbours are going to know about it because they're the ones that produce those foul odours.
Kate, what does a good compost smell like? What's the smell of good compost?
It shouldn't smell. And it seems kind of outrageous saying that. You know, if you think about putting your food waste into your garbage bin and leaving it for a week in a plastic bag, that's going to stink. So food waste can stink if it's not managed correctly. And that's because the food waste in plastic becomes anaerobic. Food waste and carbon in your compost bin, when it is aerobic and it has the right balance of green and browns, shouldn't really smell like anything. If anything, it should be a bit earthy. So really your nose knows. If you start smelling bad odors, which is something that you will come across that when you start composting. You are going to make compost occasionally that is a bit whiffy, and that's fine, because what that's telling you is there's that colony of bad bacteria starting to take over, but you can do something about that. You can aerate it. You can add more dry carbon. So composting, really, when you're composting successfully, shouldn't smell like anything, basically. So it should have a good smell, a forest floor smell. And there will be stages, especially if you have overloaded it with heaps of fruit waste or manure. You're going to smell those particular ingredients, but as it starts breaking down, it really should smell like earth. It should smell like soil. If you can go back just one more moment. So that's when talking about the smell of compost. So when I talk about cooking compost, you might decide to explore hot compost. And I'll very quickly go through that process, because I think for North Sydney Council constituents may not be something that you're as likely to do, but it is a really great process. Basically, the main difference with that and cold compost is filling your bin all at once. So you stockpile your greens and your browns, and you fill up your ideally 400 litre bin or bigger, and you then create enough critical volume for thermophilic microbes to take over, and you really will have your compost cooking. So it can get to 60 degrees Celsius within 24 hours, and that's the target temperature that you're wanting to aim for. Slow compost, so that's what most of you are going to be doing in your backyards, is when you slowly and gradually add a bucket of food waste and a bucket of browns, and then a couple of days later add another bucket of food waste, some dead plant matter from your garden, and then a bit more brown. So adding it slowly. You won't ever have really high temperatures within that method, but you'll actually have finished compost that is higher in nutrients and higher in nitrogen, because nitrogen gets off-gassed through, some of it gets off-gassed through the hot composting process. So even if you're cold composting, you've still got a lot of activity that's going to be happening. And when you've filled your bin, it's not like only with a cold compost, only at the end, once your bin is full, does it work. It's working throughout the whole process. But once you have filled your bin, you then need to allow those compost microbes to continue breaking down your food waste, compost worms to join the picture as well, slaters, all of those insects will start breaking down your scraps, as well as all of the microscopic life that I've mentioned, so fungi and bacteria and actinomycetes. There's all of these amazing microbes that are doing their thing. So while that's happening, you need to be checking for moisture, and you need to be aerating it, because as compost microbes, both the ones that we can see and the ones that we can't see, they use up oxygen while they're breaking down the scraps. And you can imagine the surface size of the organic matter is getting smaller as it breaks down, and that pushes out oxygen from your mix. And when there's not oxygen, then we have odors. So it's really important to be checking that things are not drying out or things are not too wet and there's enough air. Finally, compost curing. Now, it's something that people don't, in my opinion, talk about enough. And it's really important. So once you have looked at your compost and it no longer looks like food waste and carbon, it looks like soil, you still need to do one final process, and that's this period of maturation, where you leave the organic matter ideally for 6 weeks to 2 to 3 months, and it just basically mellows and sits, and it becomes when you've got compost that's new, it can be too rich. It allows the whole suite of all of those compost invertebrates, especially worms, to continue breaking down the organic matter, making sure all of the nutrients are in plant available forms. Because if you use compost too early, it can have what's called phototoxic chemicals in it, which are naturally forming chemicals, but they're stuff that plants don't like. But if you leave your compost to sit for a while, for a couple of months ideally, then it will be perfect to be applied onto your garden. That process does generally mean needing 2 bins. And if that's not something that you can fit in your backyard, you can cure your compost under a tarp. So you can take your on-ground bin off your compost and chuck a tarp over the top so it doesn't get too wet. Basically, the most contact that your compost can have with the soil, the better, because it will cure more quickly. And well-cured compost, when you pick up a handful of it, should feel crumbly, should be friable, should be dark and rich in color. And if you smell it as well, it really should smell like the soil. If it has any pungent odors or if it smells a bit acidic, it's not ready. You need to, even though it may look like soil, you need to let it sit and cure for longer. Any questions about that at this point?
We've got lots of questions.
Well, we've got time.
Yeah, there's some really good questions. I suppose a few questions about cockroaches, worms. Are they good to have in a compost bin?
Yes. So now I like to take a bit of a pacifist approach to the insects that you're going to have in your bin. You can imagine that, well, actually, first of all, it's interesting to note that 2 ways that you can increase the biodiversity in your own backyard is first and foremost having a compost bin, because having compost in our sterile backyards is basically like a dance party, a seething mass of life for all of the creatures that have been deprived by our sterile, neat backyards that are, mowed constantly. It brings life to your garden. So you will have lots of different insects in there, and you want to have that. There are obviously insects that you're going to look at and love, like worms. And then there's other critters that you might think, like cockroaches. Oh, do I really want that in my compost? Cockroaches, if you see the occasional 1 or 2, they're totally fine. They are there eating your organic matter. They're generally the cockroaches that you find in your compost are not the ones that are going to be coming into your house anyway. But if you start having a cockroach problem, that can be a sign that something's a bit off in your bin. Often it's a sign that your organic matter is too dry. And you can actually use naturally occurring, it's a mined product, so does have some sustainable question marks around it, but it is a natural pesticide. It's called diatomaceous earth. And what you can do with that is sprinkle that on top of your compost if you've got a cockroach infestation, and it attacks any insects that have an exoskeleton. So that is cockroaches, but it also is ants. It also is spiders. It doesn't discriminate what it's going to kill, but it won't kill your worms. And it is something that organic gardeners do use. So you can sprinkle that into your compost if you've got a lot of cockroaches. But if you have 1 or 2, honestly, don't stress, because they're all compost critters that are going to be breaking down your organic matter and turning it into compost.
Great. Just quickly, a couple of questions about using animal products in the Bokashi bin. Can you then put it into the compost bin after it's been fermented?
Yes. So Bokashi compost is something that I'm really passionate about because, as I said earlier, I am a no rules composter. I love composting all of the waste that I generate, and we are a meat eating household. So I add meat to my Bokashi compost bin. For those of you not familiar with this form of compost, basically it's not an aerobic oxygen-rich process that's happening in your standard backyard compost bin. It's an anaerobic process, but you are inoculating it with what's called EM, effective microorganisms, that ferment your waste. So once you have fermented your food waste, and if you have added meat into it, you can safely add it into your both hot or cold compost bin. And the reason is the conditions within your Bokashi bin have become quite acidic during the fermentation process. So pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella won't will be killed off by the natural acids and enzymes that are created by the effective microorganisms. So then you can add that into your compost bin because the waste has been fermented. And when you add it into a cold or hot compost bin, it breaks down incredibly fast. You can also process it directly in your soil by digging a hole and burying it, or in a soil factory, which I'll get to later. So yes, you can add Bokashi with meat into your compost bin. That's fine. It's safe to do. I'll just quickly say the slide previously, Jordan, I just want to mention, sometimes people feel like once they've got this compost, they're not really sure what to do with it. So if you live in an apartment and you do have access to an outdoor area and you do have a compost bin, but if there's, pushback with people wanting you to use the compost, you can always apply it to pot plants. So container gardens love compost because you can imagine pot plants are like little desert islands. They're not connected to soil, so they need a lot of nutrition. So you can add them to your pot plants. You can use your well-cured compost on your lawn. So lawns are incredibly hungry, and you can broadcast finished compost over your lawn, and within a couple of days, especially if it's in summer, the life in the lawn and the soil will consume it, and that's a great way to naturally feed your lawn. You can use it in your veggie gardens. I like doing what's called no-dig gardening. So in the past, people would always think that you needed to turn your compost and dig it through your soil, but actually that's not the best thing to do. It is a really good idea if you've got mulch on your soil to pull back the mulch and just put a surface layer, as much as 5 to 10 centimeters if you've got that much compost, over the layer of your soil, and all of the biology in your soil will start eating it because compost is soil food. Okay, we can go to the next slide now. So working out what system works best for you. So hot or cold systems, which we've touched on, you can make those in enclosed bins, which I've talked about how I fill my enclosed bins. You can also make compost in open piles or in piles that are contained with pallets. So you don't have to work in plastic. And if you are wanting to get an enclosed bin, I really encourage you to look for a secondhand one, because we're swimming in compost bins. Or even if you live in an area where there's council cleanup campaigns, people often chuck them out. So you can get yourself a secondhand one really easily. Bokashi bins, so we've started talking about that. They are brilliant for apartment dwellers because you can, and I fill up my Bokashi bins inside my house. So I'm composting effectively right in the kitchen. And as I'm filling it, when the lid is closed, it doesn't smell. Bokashi does have a distinctive smell. It's because it's a fermentation process. When you open the lid, you will smell it, but it won't. When I add meat to mine, it will not smell like putrefying meat. It smells like pickles, like strong fermented pickles, basically. So you can keep it inside your house. So that's a really brilliant option if you live in an apartment. And if you don't want to process it yourself, you can sign up to the app called Share Waste. And you should be able to find compost hosts in your local area that will take your fermented scraps from you. Or if you did want to process it yourself, but you do live in an apartment, you can do it in a soil factory. So to give you some detail about that, that can be done in an enclosed plastic bin or tub, or it can be done in a really large pot. And what you're doing is, instead of digging it into your garden bed or adding it into your compost, you're processing it in this soil factory. So to make one, you need to add at least 10 to 15 centimeters of healthy garden soil to the bottom, which if you're an apartment dweller, you'll have to beg, borrow, or please you'll need to get some soil from a friend that does have a garden. And you'll add that to the bottom of the soil factory, and then you will pour your fermented waste into that. Give it a thorough mix. So you're not, with Bokashi compost, you don't need the ratio of browns to greens, carbon to nitrogen. What you've filled your Bokashi waste with will be food waste. So all of that is nitrogen. And in the soil factory, the soil acts like the carbon. So you're not balancing it with brown leaves or newspaper or wood chips. The soil is the carbon in this instance. And that healthy garden soil, the biology in it, so the microbes, there might be worms, all of that will start breaking it down. So you're doing layers of Bokashi compost and layers of soil like a lasagna. And then it will all break down. I have a garden, so I don't need to do this, but I do still use a soil factory because we have so many Bokashi bins, and I love it. It's a really, really beautiful way to end up with incredible compost quite quickly. Worm farms. So once again, a great option for people that live in apartments, because you can get enclosed worm farms that you can keep indoors. You can also have worm farms that you can keep outdoors that are in-ground worm farms. And they're really great. You can make one yourself really easily by getting food grade buckets that you drill holes all over, bury into the soil. So worm farming, similar to composting, is an aerobic process, so it needs to have the balance of carbon to nitrogen. Worms need the carbon for their bedding material as well, so always adding in carbon-rich ingredients. Worms love coconut coir or brown leaves, newspaper, and then your food waste. And if you've buried it in the ground, you can add a handful of worms from a worm farm, from a friend's worm farm, or purchase them. Or if you've got worms in your soil, they will enter as well. So there is, my strong feeling is, if you're wanting to compost, you can find a method that will work for you. And I'm really happy to answer direct questions about your circumstance. So if you're wondering what would work for you, you can ask me those questions as well. You can use a combination of these methods too. So I personally Bokashi compost all of our food waste, and then I add it into my cold or hot compost bins. I don't add it into my worm farms because we often add citrus into our Bokashi bins, which is then fine to be processed in my compost bin. But if I add that into my worm farm, citrus has a toxin that can kill worms. And also worm farming, worms like to have quite a neutral pH, and when you first add Bokashi into whatever system you're using to process it, it is acidic, but as it breaks down, it becomes neutral.
Okay, what about paper towels in worm farms? Even if you use them maybe for cleaning sprays or they've been in contact with other sort of, household chemicals?
Depends on the chemical. So, when you start thinking about wanting to compost as much household carbon that you create, you might want to then switch to vinegar, bicarb, those simple chemicals that are not going to affect worms. And so vinegar in large amounts would, but vinegar on a paper towel wouldn't. Synthetic and harsher chemicals absolutely can be detrimental to worms, or not just worms, because worms work in partnership with compost microbes. So worms will not start eating your food waste or your paper towel until compost microbes have started breaking it down. Worms don't have teeth, so they draw the organic matter into their mouths, and they only can do that once compost microbes have broken it down and it has basically become like a slurry. So if you are using chemicals that are going to kill the microflora and fauna in your compost, then worms are not going to eat it either. So you do need to be careful of what sort of chemicals you're using. But paper towels, generally, if you've wiped up a greasy baking tray with one, or, you've wiped up some milk with one, something like that, they're totally fine to add into your worm farms.
Okay, great.
Any other questions at this point?
There are lots about rats and fruit flies. I don't know, yes. Are you going to cover that later, or do you want to talk about it now?
No, well, yes, I am going to cover it later, but I can cover it. Well, why don't you go to the next slide? So troubleshooting. I always like to think like a pest. And if you start thinking like a rodent or thinking like a fruit fly, you can actually get ahead of the game and stop them from becoming a problem. So I'll talk about vermin, rats and mice to start with. If you're using an open to the ground compost bin, and you're planning on composting meat or dairy or bread or cheese, sorry, that is dairy, it's essential to add rodent-proof mesh to the bottom. Now, this isn't chicken wire. This has a much smaller grade, so I think it's about 6 mil, and it's called rodent-proof mesh. What you need to do is measure out the diameter of your open to the ground compost bin, cut out a square, and then cut out with wire cutters. It's really easy to cut down, making sure you're wearing gloves, cut out a circle. And then you basically just squish that around the bottom of your compost bin and then fill it up as per how I've discussed previously. That barrier will stop rodents getting in. And if you have thought like a rat and thought, I'm going to be adding in scraps that rodents are going to like, and you've added that onto the bottom of your compost bin before you've filled it, you won't have any vermin problem at all. So we do have vermin in our local area, and I have put rodent-proof mesh on the bottom of all of my compost bins, and I have never had a rat or a mouse in any of my compost. So it really works. But it is kind of annoying because you have to retrofit it onto your compost bins. And then when you harvest your compost, you push it wearing gloves, push the vermin-proof mesh away from the edges, lift up your compost, and then harvest out the finished compost.
So the mesh sort of just goes over the top of the bottom edge, is that right? Just for a couple of inches?
Yeah, I do it. So I cut out my circle so that there's about 10 centimeters extra around all of the sides. So it doesn't need to be higher than that. It's about a 10 centimeter edge that goes up. Yep. And I just push it down and you kind of fold it around and push it down. It's quite pliable. So it's strong rodent-proof mesh, but it is, you can fold it and bend it. And you don't want to push it on so firmly that when you need to harvest your compost, it's a real pain to take off. If you have a small compost bin as well, so like a 200-litre compost bin, you don't even need to take it off. When you harvest your compost, you can just push your bin on the side and then turn it upside down and pour it out. But if you have a 400-litre bin, then you will need to pull off the mesh on the sides before you lift it up.
That sort of leads on to another question from Julie, talking about, do you dig your compost bin into the soil as well when you set it up?
Yes, I have experimented with that, Julie. And I probably experimented with it at a really bad time because La Nina came. And what happened was I had dug my compost bin, one of my compost bins, into the soil about 20 centimeters. And as you can imagine, that is lower than the surface level of the surrounding soil. And when there was huge amounts of rain, that became like a big puddle in the bottom of my compost bin. And the conditions at the bottom of my compost bin were anaerobic. And the compost itself was too wet. So it depends on those environmental factors, but that is another way that you can keep rodents out by digging your compost bin in. It's not foolproof though, because rodents can dig in, but it can work. So if you're not wanting to invest in rodent-proof mesh, you can dig your compost bins in like that, but you do have to be careful if there's going to be another really rainy season.
Yep, great.
So talking about flies, so flies are one of the most annoying pests when it comes to compost. So vinegar flies, fruit flies, blow flies, all of these flies are not going to be detrimental to the composting process, but they're just really annoying to have to deal with because no one wants to have to lift up the lid of their compost bin and have a whole face full of flies blowing out at them. So the first method is making sure you're always covering your food waste with carbon and digging it into the compost as well. If you have aerated your compost bin as well and drawn up food waste lower down, you then need to add some more carbon on top so that there's never food waste sitting at the top of your compost bins, because that's when flies are going to come. Some flies, like vinegar flies, are more, as noted by the name, are more attracted to acidic pH. So if you've got a lot of vinegar flies, you can add in wood fire ash, which is really alkaline, or garden lime, which, even though it sounds acidic, it actually is hugely alkaline. It's made from limestone. That helps with the compost pH. So if it's acidic, it will raise the pH up to more neutral alkaline conditions. But remember, there's that balance, because the compost microbes like working under neutral to slightly acidic conditions anyway. You can make apple cider vinegar traps as well if you've got heaps of flies attracted to your compost. If you put some apple cider in the bottom of a lid, just a plastic or metal lid, it shouldn't be a deep dish, a shallow kind of dish. So that's why a lid works well, with a drop of dishwashing liquid in it, and leave that near your compost. The flies will be attracted to that and will die in the trap. You do need to replace it every couple of days, but they work quite well. And there's also, I can't think of the name, Jordan, do you know those hanging traps that you put there's
I do. I don't know the name of them either.
I'll describe them badly to you.
If anyone does, please send it through in the chat.
the hanging traps, it's not nasty chemical. Basically, it's just this, it's a smelly inoculant that comes in powdered form, and then you add water to it, and they're hanging fly traps. You can use those. It's a bit of a catch-22, because they attract flies, because flies love the smell of them, but then they die within the trap. So you can use those in the height of summer. They work well as well. Oh, there we go. EnviroSafe Australia. Thank you. So EnviroSafe Australia fly traps, they work well. And also making sure that your compost is not too wet. So if your compost is really wet, that's often when flies will lay their eggs in the organic matter, and you'll get lots of larvae. Larvae isn't always a bad thing. So blowfly larvae is, because then you're going to have lots more blowflies. But black soldier fly larvae, which are quite distinctive, they're not maggots. So they look a bit like maggots, but they're not. They're much larger. They've got visibly segmented bodies, and they've got a tiny little black pinhead at the top. They are really revolting looking, and if you see lots of them in your compost, you'll probably freak out, but they are hugely beneficial. They're safe composters, because unlike blowflies, the black soldier fly doesn't have a mouthpiece, so can't spread pathogens. They can't eat. They only live for a few days, and their larvae is really efficient at breaking down your waste. So I would recommend, if you've got a fly problem, to Google black soldier fly larvae to look at the difference, because they look quite different to other larvae. And if you've got them, and if you can deal with how revolting they look, you should really rejoice, because they're amazing composters. They're much more efficient than worms, actually. So not all larvae is bad. If your compost does smell, that I think I've been pushing it a lot, but that means there's anaerobic bacteria starting to take over. So you need to aerate it and add dry carbon. Or pull back on the food waste for a couple of days as well, because your CN ratio is off. If your compost is not decomposing, it can be because your compost is too dry. So all of the life in your compost needs to have access to water to actually break down your scraps. It could be that you've just added food waste or carbon, a big chunk of cardboard in too big a piece. So breaking down, manually chopping things up, it only takes 10 seconds to chop up. If you've got a big piece of watermelon, chop up the rind before you add it in. The more surface area that you can expose to compost microbes and insects, the better. The faster they'll break down the scraps, and the more quickly the beneficial members of the soil food web will consume the waste, which means things like blowflies are not going to be able to get in on the action as quickly. Adding in compost activators. So Bokashi is a wonderful compost activator, as is pelletized chicken manure or fresh chicken manure, coffee grounds, So not adding in too much of those, but they're all full of nitrogen, blood and bone, dynamic lifter. All of these nitrogen-rich inputs will help speed up a sluggish compost. But don't overdo it, because you're wanting to keep that nitrogen in balance. Otherwise, you're going to get that out of balance, and it will, start becoming anaerobic. But I feel like I've given you a lot of information. I don't want to overwhelm you, because really, if you just bring all of this back to the 4 compost ingredients: nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and water. If you always think they're the 4 things that I need in my compost, and you observe what's going on, basically your compost problems will be solved with one of those 4 inputs. Any other questions at this point?
Great. I suppose just the nitrogen boosters, does that sort of apply to bringing up the heat of a compost bin if you're hot composting?
Yes. So it is basically, when you're hot composting, the heat is created from the activity of mesophilic microbes to start with, and then thermophilic microbes when it gets really hot. And they absolutely need access to nitrogen, but they need access to carbon too. So you're not going to be able to create hot compost without both of those. But when you're hot composting, when you're thinking about compost ratios, it's a great idea to add in 40% general nitrogen, so food waste, green plant matter, 10% compost activators. So they're the ingredients that are full of nitrogen: pelletized chicken manure, blood and bone, coffee grounds, things like that. 10% of that, and then 50% carbon. So you always need that balance in hot and cold compost. But in hot compost specifically, it is a good idea adding some more nitrogen-rich inputs, but still keeping that balance in check.
Yeah, great. Just in a general question around sort of the inputs in a compost bin, are there any foods that we should avoid putting in a compost bin, like McDonald's or greasy or fatty foods or anything like that?
Yes, that's a great question. So I have, not to be sort of purist, but I haven't eaten McDonald's in years. I should experiment though. I have heard that people have put a Happy Meal into a compost bin and it hasn't broken down. And that's because the preservatives are just so good at keeping this highly processed food intact. Eventually it will break down, especially if you rip it up. But you do need to be aware of highly processed food that is high in salt. So salt, when you add it into your compost, won't break down. It will remain, and it will then stay in your soil. And there's lots of, if you're growing an edible garden, there's lots of vegetables that are quite sensitive to high salinity. So you do need to be a bit aware of that. Oil as well. Oil is quite resistant to decomposition, but I personally do compost oil quite regularly, small amounts. And what I do is I either Bokashi compost it first and then add that into my hot or cold compost system, or I add the oil directly into the compost bin if it's a small amount, but I disperse it and I make sure, so I don't just pour it in one big lump. I spread it throughout the organic matter, add in dry carbon to balance it. I am aware that when I put oil into a compost bin, it's going to coat the particles, and that stops airflow. So I want to be mindful of how much I'm adding in, and then I want to aerate it thoroughly to make sure that those microbes can work efficiently. I think, we all need to be really mindful of the fact that anything that has come from a plant or an animal will break down. But whether or not you want to load up your compost bin with 10 Happy Meals, you wouldn't get great compost from the end of it. So always thinking about balance. So balance, diversity, and moderation with those sort of more trickier scraps.
Yeah, great. And I suppose that would apply to avocado skins, citrus, garlic skins. They could all be composted, can they? But
yes, avocado skin's quite resistant to decomposition. So they've they have got a lot of cellulose in them, but a cellulose in a form that is resistant to decay. So you'll find that and avocado seeds as well, they take a long time to decompose, but it's worth doing it. And to be honest, it's worth cycling them through a couple of times if you need to. So fishing out an avocado seed or a bit of skin that hasn't broken down from compost that has, so everything else is beautiful, friable compost, and chucking that back into the compost to break down on the second way through the next lot of compost is worth it. Because, I just think that we as gardeners, our soil is so often lacking in organic matter, and the organic matter in your soil is what is essential for having happy, healthy, disease-resistant plants. So I think capturing as much fertility from all of these different scraps, even if they are a bit of a bugger to compost, and you do have to compost them through a couple of times, is worth it. But citrus, I will just talk about that quickly. Citrus, because it is waxy and because it has the toxin is called I think I might be mispronouncing it, lemonin. And worms, if worms consume a large amount of it, they will die. So that's why you shouldn't be adding lots of citrus into a worm farm. But you can add it into a compost bin because it doesn't affect compost microbes. But the citrus itself, because it has that waxy skin and there's lots of volatile citrus oils, it does take a long time to break down. So making sure you've chopped it up or you've Bokashi composted it first so that it's fermented and breaks down more quickly. And keeping that ratio in check, because if you add a huge amount of citrus, then your compost will end up being more acidic, too acidic for things to happen, for all of the processes to happen efficiently. So always making sure things are balanced. Any more questions?
I think we've pretty much, there was a good question from Stephanie about how much sun should a compost be exposed to? Do they need to be exposed to sun, sit in the sun?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. So I think first and foremost, just put your compost bin where it is convenient to access. So if you hide it all the way back, you may want to hide it because I think compost bins look beautiful, but lots of people may not think so. So put it somewhere that's convenient. But in terms of sun, if you are composting in winter, it is useful having your compost in a sunnier location. And that is because if your organic matter can remain warm, then there is going to be more activity from mesophilic microbes that are active in temperatures that are between 20 to 40 degrees. There are a group of cold compost microbes that will be breaking down your scraps in the dead of winter if you've put it in a really shady position, but they're just not as efficient. So to keep those compost microbes happy, that they bloom and multiply in warmer conditions. So putting it in a sunny spot is useful. But in the height of summer, if you've got we're having temperatures of 35 to 45 degrees Celsius. If you've got your bin in a full sun position, what's going to happen is it's going to dry out really quickly. And a lot of the other biology in your compost bin, like worms, is going to die. So it may well be beneficial in the height of summer to put it in a shady spot. So if you can move it around your garden, that's a useful thing to do.
Good one, Kate. I think we've covered all the questions. So yeah, thank you so much. I think that's really good information for everyone if they're complete beginners, to get started, and for those who have already started to sort of problem solve and revitalize their compost bin. So yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure. I hope I haven't overwhelmed anyone, and I hope you feel excited to do it, because really I do want to make sure you know that composting, it's a grand experiment. Every batch is going to be different. There's going to be batches that you think, oh, I wish my compost was like this all the time. And compost happens every day in nature, and it will happen in your own backyard. But with those few tips and tricks, you'll be able to make great compost, hopefully, every time.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone hasn't seen Kate's Instagram account, jump on. I'll send the link in the follow-up email tomorrow. But she's creates amazing content that's really accessible and helps explain the process, I suppose, and it'd be good sort of support and from this webinar as well. And I completely agree with Kate about finding a second-hand compost bin if you can on Marketplace or Gumtree, but also we as a council provide 50% discount via the Compost Revolution program. So if you can't find anything, then come to us, and I'll send the link as well. So yeah, North Sydney residents can get 50% off plus free delivery. But yeah, so thank you everyone. Thanks again, Kate.
Thank you, that was great.
Good luck with your compost bins. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.